delivered, as well as what's coming ahead. And I'll also at the end touch base a little bit on some of topics that I know the Commission is interested with. Starting with the reliability imperative, and that's the framework that we've leveraged as an organization over the last few years to really rely the work that we're doing in different areas. We put that in 4 different pillars. Work that has to do with reforms and enhancements to our markets, work that needs to be done on the transmission planning side, efforts that are needed in actually improving our processes, our control room operation, as well as just reforming and transforming our systems, our technology systems, all this to really prepare us for the future. The future is before us. We're seeing a lot of things already come to fruition, and the work that we've done is already helping, and I'll help highlight some of that. So as we've laid out this reliability imperative over the last few years, I know that we've had some pushback over the last few years on whether some of the tight conditions that we were forecasting and expecting, or just the reduction in the reserve margins, whether that was actually happening or not. So we've had signals within our markets that showed that level of tightness. But I wanted to highlight at least a couple artifacts that I know you all may be very familiar with, one being the OMS MISO survey that we produce every year. This is the last snapshot of it, showing that under different scenarios that we are seeing lower margins. Usually the question we get was, when we're projecting tightness, is that actually materializing? Well, that's the questions of forecasting something versus the actual. There's a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of assumptions, and we can, as we for this year, as an example, we expected that we should see some level of tightness. As the numbers are coming in, we're seeing that we may be okay this year, but again, we're playing at the margin. And then there is an artifact that NERC were collecting the different data from the different RTOs and highlighting kind of their own assessment of where we're at. And as you can see, highlighting also that within the MISO region that things are getting a little tighter. All this to reinforce not a level of urgency that we need to continue the work that we've embarked on, and that it is important work if we want to get ready and be ready for the fleet transition. So the good news is we've started this journey a few years ago. Some efforts have already been underway, some already implemented. Things like our seasonal construct. So we have this resource adequacy construct that gives us this view of, do we have sufficient resources to meet the expected demand and the risk for the upcoming year? We went from having an annual view to having a seasonal view. That was turned out to be a really good move because it's starting to provide us a level of visibility and granularity and how the risk is shifting. The days of, if you're good on your summer peak day in the summer, that you're good the whole year, no longer holds true. So we are being forced, we can't use those simplifying assumptions that we've used for years that served us really well. We're having to complicate things. We're having to look at things in a more granular method so that we can send proper signal and start to shift and start to highlight that the risk is shifting to seasons like winter. Second, we've had reforms related to the pricing within our resource adequacy construct. For the longest time, our market would produce prices that showed that really came with provided a level of comfort that, hey, we have low prices. It means that we're flush. And then we had surprise back in 2022 where prices skyrocketed, and everybody looks around and said, why don't we have a market that does exactly what it's supposed to, which is provide us the signal. So as we get tighter, you should see prices that reflect that to send the signal to the different entities, load-serving entities, the regulators, that the conditions are getting tighter. So that's what we've embarked on. Fortunately, FERC has approved our filing, and this will be the first year where we will perform and run a planning resource auction with that reliability-based demand curve, which is the reformed pricing. And the last one I want to mention, this is one where we've just received here recently within the last few months, approval from FERC on the accreditation. We've had a couple accreditation reforms before the commission, and both approved, one that is already in place, that is already helping highlight better accreditation that ties to the performance of the resources. So that's been working really well. And this will be a little bit more future looking. It won't go live until 28, 29, but we're starting to also already signal and produce these accreditation values so that load-serving entities, commissions can start leveraging that information into their IRP processes. All right, so I want to spend just a few more minutes on the reliability-based demand curve and this upcoming planning resource auction. So as I mentioned, with this enhancement, we do believe that we'll get better price signal, that's when we're 1 megawatt over, it won't send a signal that everything is great. And when we're 1 megawatt short, it shouldn't also send a signal that the sky is falling, because neither one of those outcomes are appropriate. There is a continuum, and prices will be a little bit more commensurate with the risk. Wanted to provide some of the key timelines coming up here. So we're in the midst of the registration, and all the different load-serving entities, market participants are registering the asset right now, providing us reviewing the load forecast, etc. But the auction, the bidding window opens up on the 26th, March 26th, and it will close on the 31st. Then we usually have 20 days to run our auction, and you should expect results to be posted by April 28th. So we usually have a business day. After that is usually when we have a workshop and we walk through the results. So if the commission wants the opportunity to hear a little bit more about those results, that'd be kind of like the date after the 28th is when we'll be better positioned to have some of those discussions. All right, and I believe this is one of the last couple slides I have. Just want to spend a few minutes talking about within our resource adequacy construct, there is a lot of discussion on reliability metrics and what that means. So the way I think about it, there's a couple things. When we think about reliability metrics, it's nothing more than a way to just capture or quantify a risk. Then there's what I call a standard. So the standard is that MISO uses and a lot of entities use within the industry is 1 day in 10. And that basically says, let's make sure that let's make sure that we bring enough resources so that we don't experience any risks of an event and events that happen 1 day in 10 years. So that's the standard. The 1 day in 10 years is a standard. There's a lot of discussions on whether that specific metric or standard is the appropriate one. There is work at NERC that is being done. And I can tell you that that metric has served us well for the last few years. The fact that a lot of entities are using it, there is a lot of processes within IRPs, within different RTOs that leverage this. There is a good reason to compute and measure metrics in different shape, whether this currently measures the frequency, a 1 day in 10 years. There's other metrics that help you capture more of a duration of an event. So if we're starting to see events that are, from a risk perspective, are longer, there is a good reasons to start looking into that, or start looking into magnitude, of being concerned of less about the frequency or even the duration, but more about not having to ever experience an event where we lose more than 200 megawatts, 1,000 megawatts. And that's what people within the industry often refer to as expected and served energy. So ultimately, we've always looked into some of those metrics. We've told stakeholders that we'll continue computing these metrics, but the work to make this a standard and change the standard is a lot more significant and bigger, and requires a lot more coordination with regulators, with others in the industry. So we don't have at this point any plans to change, but there is certainly a lot of work related to that effort. And finally, and and I think this is my last slide. Again, as I started, we have this framework of reliability imperative. A lot of the work that I just highlighted and covered falls under this market redefinition. Just wanted to share a list of initiatives that certainly were completed here within the last year. But there is certainly a lot of work ahead of us. My key message here really is the work that we've done is actually providing a meaningful signal for load-serving entities to understand the risk and see how they need to adjust. But we're getting to learn a lot more about this new portfolio that we're getting to operate. And that also means going back to our processes and see what needs to be changed. So with that, I'll certainly take questions or move it to my colleague, Andy.
Are there commission questions at this time? All right, we'll go ahead and proceed with SPP's presentation. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. We still have more MISO.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. Andy Whitmire, Director of Resource Utilization for MISO. I'll talk about the status of our queue and our new ARIS proposal, which is now called the Expedited Resource Addition Study. So just first off, there's a lot of changing factors going on within the industry that has caused both slowdowns in the queue, slowdowns of generation coming online, and of course, fast retirements from resources. So we've seen significant increases in our queue. A lot of that was driven in 2022 by the approval of the Inflation Reduction Act from Congress that really added a lot of incentives for new renewable energy projects. And that caused significant growth in the amount of projects in our queue and really kind of slowed us down on our ability to be able to study those. Those plus inefficient queue rules from previous cycles causing a lot of restudies of these older cycles have just kind of slowed us down. And so then we have generators that have gotten out of our queue and have gotten GIAs, and they've been slow to come online. And that on top of new spot load growth that we've seen over the last year, where we've seen a lot of new data centers coming online. So all of those have kind of accumulated to the need that as we work through our queue backlog, there's a need to both fix that backlog and do more improvements to our queue to speed that up, but also develop new projects to be able to, or new processes to be able to get new generation online faster to get a GIA. As far as the status of our current queue, there's over 300 projects, over 300 gigawatts of projects in our queue, over 1,700 projects spaced across our 15-state footprint. We study those into 5 separate regions and 5 separate studies that you can see there on the left-hand side. In 2022, we approved a queue timeline of about a year. At the time, we were getting, on average, 50 gigs into our queue a year. And so we thought, well, so with improvements, we'll be able to get that down to a year. So we changed that tariff timeline. But then again, since that time, we've had the explosion in the amount of requests we've had. We had 171 gigawatts, so 3 times our average come in 2022. And then in 2023 queue, we had 123 gigawatts come in. So that has caused cycles to take 3 to 4 years to complete. And so how do we, one, and speed that queue process up, and then 2, provide another avenue temporarily to be able to get new resources online that can address these spot load additions that we're seeing throughout our footprint. As far as what we're doing to improve our current queue, in 2023, we went through a wide range of queue reforms to increase the amount of capital that's at risk if you enter the queue, increase the site control requirements, and things like that to improve the quality of the projects that come into our queue. That was approved by FERC in January 2024, and those were implemented in our 23 queue cycle. So that 23 queue cycle was 123 gigawatts. So we did see a 20% reduction in the number of projects that were in it for the year before. but it's still not quite enough to still a significant amount of new generation. That's as much as we have load currently in our footprint. And so we still need to have ways to continue to reduce the amount of projects that are coming into your queue and that we're studying at one time. And so that leads us to what we have currently pending in front of FERC today, which is a cap. We've requested FERC to allow us to study projects in smaller batches. If you think about the evolution of the queue in FERC orders, starting back from order 2003, it was you study projects as they come in. MISO was the first to start clustering projects, and so we did that and had that approved in 2015, and we improved on it in 2017. And so it allowed us to be able to process queues more faster in batches instead of serial mode. Well, now with the explosion of the amount of projects in our queue, now we have to go back to start taking smaller bites of those large queue cycles so you can process them better. Gives you a better dispatch in your study models because you are not just looking at the new generation, but you're looking at the existing generation that's continued to be online and serve load. And so that queue cap is currently pending in front of FERC, and we hope to be able to have that approved by the end of this month and utilize that in our upcoming queue cycle in September. Additionally, we've partnered with a developer called Pearl Street. They developed a software. SPP has been using them for a couple of years. We brought them in at the beginning of last year to help us improve our study process. So what we're doing is working to actually automate all of our studies for phase one. We study our queue in 3 phases. It allows for standard off ramps for projects that don't want to stay in the queue and don't want to get built. So the automation will allow us to study the projects, build the model, study them much more quickly, use standard process rules on what the standard upgrade would be, what the cost would be. So the idea is that we give interconnection customers study results quicker so they can make their decision faster and allow us to move on to the studies later on. You normally see a 30 to 40% dropout rate at least between phase 1 and phase 2. So the faster we can get to that phase 2 and 3 to study the better projects, the better. Other reforms that happened in 2024, MISO SPP has been working on what's called the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue Study that we kicked off in 2020. We were able to finally get FERC approval of that in November of 24, and our boards approved a $1.6 billion portfolio of projects along our seam at our December board meetings. So that framework will become available in our next queue cycles as well. Additionally, FERC is doing their own type of improvements. They've adopted most of the reforms that MISO has championed over the years and put into place in Order 2023. So we filed our compliance with that in the summer of 24 and hope to hear from FERC on that soon. So now what's next? So again, as we work this backlog, the cap, the automation, JTIQ, Order 200 compliance, as all of those are taking into effect, what else is next? So we have this temporary time frame while all those reforms take effect over the next couple of years, and we know that there's going to be load growth from these spot loads and new generation that needs to be paired with that to be able to come online. And so that's the point of the expedited resource decision study that we'll go into more detail. Another important tool that we soft launched last week, you can go to our website and we have a commercial operation date tracker, something that we took from SPP. They've been doing this for a year or so. We've created a tool. You can go on, interactive tool. You can go to our website. You can filter by your state, and you can see all the projects that are pending that have a GIA in your state by field type and be able to see, the expected in-service date for those projects. So a little more detail on the Q cap and the automation. Again, we set a standard cap of 50% for those 5 planning regions. So we'll study 50% of the coincidental peak for that load. That's how much new generation that we will study in each of those Q cycles. That allows for a much better solution. If you think about if you were trying to study all that at one time, let's take the 23 Q cycle with 123 gigawatts. There's about 123 gigawatts of load in MISO. So that means you're turning down all of your existing generation to zero just so that these new resources are what's serving the load. That's a much different flow pattern on the system, and a flow pattern that's not going to be real because you know a lot of those projects are going to drop out. So by having a cap on the number of projects we start at one time, it allows for much more reasonable dispatch and less overloads. Less overloads mean less study work to be able to determine upgrades for those overloads. So that's in essence, the reason for the volume cap, and our expectation that it'll let us to process future queue cycles faster. And again, the automation that we're partnering with Pearl Street will certainly allow us to process phase one much faster. Now to ERAS. So again, we've changed the name to Expedited Resource Addition Study. The main reason there is that we wanted to continue. We were getting concerns about folks that thought ERAS was the new way to get resources online for resource adequacy. And that's not the case. The queue is still the standard way for projects to enter into MISO's processes to get a GIA and come online. ERAS is really tailored to those unexpected spot loads. States and RERAs, or Regulatory Electric Retail Regulatory Authorities, RERAs, they have been doing their job and planning out what their resources should be over the next 5-10 years. But what they weren't planning is all these new spot loads, right? And so that was really what is the driver behind ERAS, is that how do we provide a process to be able to address these unexpected load additions. The expectation is that the LSEs, the load serving entities within our footprint, will be the ones that submit those. It's a temporary process. It's meant to just be, it has a sunset date of December 31st, 2028, which is tied to our Order 2023 compliance, which is any queue cycle after that date has to be done within the 1-year tariff timeline, or we're dealing with penalties. So we expect all of the automation and queue improvements that we put in place will allow those queues to be processed within a year by that time. And so that's why ERAS is temporary in nature. We just had a PAC meeting yesterday, a planning advisory committee with our stakeholders. So we went in detail in that as we talked about the changes that we've done to the proposal since we rolled it out in November and in December. In particular, the name change, the sunset date, which I just mentioned. The need for ERAS is that there's an acknowledgement by the RERA that this project is necessary. So we're continuing to work with the Organization of MISO States on what that framework looks like, that the RERA, which in Missouri is likely the commission staff here, or potentially the municipal co-op boards for those municipalities that are in Missouri. How the framework that they would notify MISO about, hey, I have this resource that we're evaluating in our processes. It's needed for this load. We recognize that. We want you to study it and process it through ERAS while we're doing our we are still continuing going with both our stakeholders and OMS. One of the concerns we've heard about is more guardrails. We want to reduce the number of projects that go to ERAS. I do as well, selfishly. My team, can't process that many more requests going through ERAS, so we need to make sure just the best projects and those that are necessary for these new RA needs go through this process. As an additional change since December is we have pushed our filing date out to mid-March. So we expect to come back to our stakeholder meetings in February with our full suite of changes that are necessary to implement ERAS, be able to gather feedback, and then file that in mid-March, which would allow it to work by middle of May, and allow us to start utilizing it come June 1st of 2025. This is a quick checklist of what the requirements are for ERAS. Couple of the main differences between this and the projects that would go through our normal queue is, one, it's a much higher non-refundable deposit because this is a whole new process that MISO has to bring forward. There's a lot of overhead that MISO is responsible for creating, and so there's a higher D1. The M2, which is the amount of money per megawatt you have to provide us as collateral, is much higher. It's $8,000 per megawatt in the normal queue. So that higher amount shows the commitment that the LSE has to this project that they're bringing forward, and that money would be used to fund any network upgrades that are associated with that project. We're requiring 100% site control at submission for both the site itself and where it's going to connect to the grid. Right now, we only require 100% site control for the generator site itself when you go into the queue. So again, these projects have to be ready to go when they're submitted and have all the necessary site control to be able to do that. The RERA acknowledgement is new, which is the main crux of it. The Federal Power Act gives the states the authority for resource adequacy. So we have to recognize that these projects are necessary to meet that need. And that's why we're partnering with OMS on how that checklist looks like and what we would like to see from those RERAs when they're acknowledging that project and asking us to evaluate it. And then lastly, the commercial operation date. We want to make sure that these projects are going to be online quickly. And so the application commercial operation date, it can be no more than 3 years out. We've had some concerns with how does ERAS interact with our neighbors. Our neighbors still get the right to study these projects that go through ERAS. So in Missouri, that's SPP, that's AECI, potentially TVA. Those neighboring entities to MISO, they have the right to study these projects, the impact that they might have on their system. We won't be able to, although we'll be able to get a generator, a GIA much quickly through ERAS, there'll still be some risk to those projects because they may not know what their impact is to their neighbors. We do know though, if they qualify for JTIQ, well, then that would be, they would be part of JTIQ, they'd pay the JTIQ rate, and then that would suffice the effect system study for SPP. SPP later on today, they'll talk about their own development of an ERAS type process. We're working with them on potentially a way for us both to prioritize our ERAS projects over the other ones. So if we're successful with this, then the hope is that we can prioritize these ERAS projects through the AFS process with them to be able to give more certainty to these projects as they're going through ERAS. Again, this is just our filing deadline. We did push that to mid-March. We'll have that final package to our stakeholders in February, and then we'll have a special PAC meeting either the Monday or Friday, that first week of March, to finalize the proposal, go over any feedback that we received from February, and then file in mid-March. And that's the end of my presentation. Be happy to take any questions now or.
All right, we'll have commission questions then. Chair Hahn?
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. I'm just going to start at the beginning of your presentation. Kind of a political question, but given the changing political landscape and IRA, the impact of IRA filling up your queue, what do you think the impact could be moving forward? I know IRA is currently mostly intact, but there could be changes on it moving forward. So talk to me about what you envision in the future.
Well, as I think about MISO is field agnostic, right? So, we have many states within MISO that have full renewable energy standards and some that don't. And so any of our processes that we bring forward have to be field agnostic, ERAS in particular. Certainly, there could be changes to the IRA. That means the incentives that these projects might have. So what it could lead to is faster dropouts of those projects that are on the cusp of economic viability. But from my perspective, the faster projects that are uneconomical to get out of the queue, the faster I can process my queue. Right? There is a lot of healthy support for renewables throughout our footprint. Obviously, there's at least 3 states that have 100% renewable energy goals within MISO. Many others have some percentage of renewable goals, and so we will need that generation to come through the queue and come online to meet all those goals. But we also see that that the AI boom that we're experiencing today, as we talk to these hyperscalers who are building these data centers, they want 99.9% reliability, right? They want to be able to run these data centers full out and it would never stopping. And so how do we take that into consideration? How do states and RERAs and LSCs take that into consideration when they consider what's the best resource mix that they need to be able to meet that expectation? And so that we could see a change in what is coming into our footprints in the future because of that.
And Madam Chair, if I may add to that, I think also not only at the administration side, but you also see a new chair at FERC. And I think it's important that you're seeing across the footprint, and I know SPP is going to talk about that, that all of us are looking at ways to get resources on the grid faster. So with us filing, SPP filing, PJM filing on these expedited queues or expedited process to meet this load, I mean, you heard announcements of AI coming, more incentives to bring data centers, remanufacturing homes. So I think it's early to tell. But I think Andy hit it on the head. We'll start seeing it officially when projects start withdrawing out of our queue. But I think it's early, and we'll evaluate as we continue to see this administration grow and FERC, the new FERC chairman, as we see that.
Thank you. One other question about IRA. What was the queue wait time? Timeline to get online prior to IRA?
So, we were trending 2 to 3 years. And, our hope was that in 2022, when we implemented a 1-year queue time in our tariff, that we'd be able to get to there. It wasn't just the explosion of the amount of projects in our queue that slowed it down, but it also was our inefficient queue rules. In particular, the ability for projects to drop out at the very last minute with very little penalty. So as these projects that are entered into our 17, in 2017, 2018, 2019, the economics of these projects have changed significantly, due to inflation and other issues, that the cost to build these projects have changed. And so we had rules in our tariff that if the cost to interconnect went high enough, from earlier estimates, they'd be able to drop out and get all their money back and no harm to the projects. And so we're seeing that in our last phase of these early projects from 18, 19, 20, 21, even before the huge increase from the projects in our 22 queue, that we're seeing them drop out one at a time. And it's causing us to do a complete restudy of that whole cycle. I know SPP is suffering from this restudy issue as well. So that was a real reason that in 2024, the queue reforms that FERC approved in January 24 that are implemented in our 23 queue cycle is what's known as an automatic withdrawal penalty. So depending on how late you withdraw, you're automatically giving up some amount of money. So these projects that would drop out in phase 3 for these later queue cycles, they'd be forfeiting up to 75% of their original M2, which was $8,000 a megawatt. So that's a significant amount of money that they'd have to write off if they do these late stage dropouts. So we think that's going to really help our 23 and later queues process and remove that late stage dropouts. Unfortunately, our older queue cycles that are still ongoing, 19, 20, 21, even 22, don't have that. We weren't able to implement those because of concerns of retroactive rate making.
So this process is a 3-year, I hear a 3-year sunset. Talk to me about how that works. Just logistically, if you apply in a year, but it's 3 years until your project comes online, but you're still using that same process and it's sunset. So just walk me through the logistics of how it operates.
Sure. So, again, you think about our standard queue, you're processing a bunch of projects together, so that's efficient. But then when one project drops out, now you have all these restudies, right? And so that was the point of a standard queue having off ramps between phase 1 and phase 2, and phase 2 and phase 3. So that leads to a little bit of a churn in a normal queue. If you think about eras, we're going to be And so there's not going to be any dropouts, right? It's just that one project. So we're able to study that one project that gets submitted to us much faster. The expectation is we can get that done in 3 months or so to be able to study that individual project and get that. If you go back to how our queues worked from 2003, the original order 2003, up to when we first started clustering in the 15-16 timeframe, that's how we were doing it. We'd study one at a time. You could do it. You could get that GIA for that single unit in 3 months or so. But what ended up happening is you started getting these huge queue cycles because of the number of projects. Big at the time, right? That was 30, 40, 50 gigs, not the 100 gigs that we see today. And so when you looked at the math and say, well, I have this many requests and I'm going to do them serial, it's going to take me 100 years to get all these projects, right? And so that's how we moved to the clustering process. So ERAs going back does go to that serial mode, but the expectation is the number of projects that we get through ERAs is going to be very, very low, right? The expectation is that it's just going to be a couple projects, per state, per quarter that we may see, because you're not seeing that many data centers. I mean, the data centers are coming in and they're huge, but you're not going to see. You don't need to. ERAs is a supplement. It's an extra tool in the toolbox to help up the supplement resource adequacy needs. It's not the way to meet resource adequacy needs, right? So the expectation is that we have such a small amount of these projects being submitted every quarter that we're able to process those individually and still be able to focus on the queue itself. So we do not see ERAs projects as slowing down all of the work that we're doing to speed up our regular queue. And because the small amount of projects that a REWA would acknowledge would allow us to study through ERAs would be small enough that we'd be able to process those quickly in parallel with the standard queue.
And if I can add to that, Andy, great job. I think to get the real question, it's 3 years. So if you apply within those 3 years, you're part of the ERAS program. So 3 years out in November of 2028, I think is this, like, you would still be able to be in the ERAS. We will just not take any new applications under the ERAS formula, because that January, because of a FERC order and we start getting penalties, we should have our queue down to 1 year. So the need for ERAS will dissipate.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Yeah, so
Thank you.
Sorry. I'm Bob Kuzman from MISO.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Adam.
I think that's an important distinction. So as we think about the next 3 years, the ERAs would be available. So we would look at these on a quarterly basis. They come in, very small amount coming in through ERAs. And also in that same 3-year time frame, we'll have a 25, 26, 27 queue cycle every year, right? And the idea is this would sunset because when we have a 28 cycle that would kick off in the fall of 28, that cycle has to be done in a year. Otherwise, we're suffering penalties per order 2023, for order 2023. And so our expectation is that all the work we're doing with the queue improvements will allow that queue to be 1 year, and then now ERAs is no longer necessary.
Thank you.
Are there other commission questions? Commissioner Holzman, go ahead.
Just so I understand a little better, does the RTO have unilateral authority to move these projects up in the queue, or do you require FERC to approve them, or are there other? Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I should let you finish. Yes, we will require FERC approval for allow this to occur.
Okay, and we know we've got a new chairman coming in. Has there been any indication at all in their past writings how they feel about ERAS or how they feel about jumping queue jumping?
Yeah, certainly. FERC precedent is equal access, right? But not undue equal access, right? And so I think the current landscape of the queue delays that we have, these new spot loads that we're experiencing, you may have read it in the news that people are calling it the AI arms race, right? They've queued that term. So there's certainly an understanding that we're in an unprecedented time. And so MISO's expectation is that because of what we're facing and what we're facing today, that we can be successful at FERC by getting this approved.
And you said that it has to be fuel neutral.
Correct.
But do you think that if it's obviously, you're going to have to say it's fuel neutral, but it's not going to be fuel neutral. There will be, projects that are, either natural gas or renewables. Do you have an indication that FERC would be selective in what they authorized on the queue jumping based on politics of the fuel?
I do not. I do not think that FERC would opine on that. From our perspective, it's the RERA, the Federal Power Act puts the states clearly in the driver's seat for adequacy. They're the ones that determine what type of resources they want to utilize to serve the load in their jurisdiction. And so, I think that's MISO could be fuel neutral. And if the states, the commissions, the RERAs, they would have their own selection criteria as to what they think should be able to be processed through ERAs and go through that process.
Okay, so my last question is what role will the state commissions play in this process?
Yes, so certainly that acknowledgement form, right? So if an LSC just submits the paperwork, all those requirements that were on the presentation, if they don't have that RERA acknowledgement from the RERA, right? Now, we're working with OMS on what that framework would look like. So that could be universal across all the 15 states and jurisdictions and under MISO. But states could also come up with their own criteria that they would use and say, hey, the tariff language that we would submit to FERC would have that ability to say, here's what the standard form would be, but we give prudence to the states to be able to say, hey, we want it, this is what we expect to see.
Commissioner, on that, I think that's been the hurdle, right? 15 different jurisdictions, 15 different ways to handle things. That's why it's important for all of OMS to make the language broad enough that each state could decide how they want to handle it and MISO would accept. So I think OMS is not only the commissioners, but the working groups and the staff are helping immensely on this to rally around sort of that language. So I want to thank the staff and the commissioners that are on OMS for the hard work they're doing to put into this, because it's an important factor as we go forward. Different states have different needs, and we want to make sure that the resources that are coming forward in ERAS meet also those state needs. So it's important to do that. So hopefully I answered your question.
Yeah. Have you thought about, the potential conflicts that are going to arise between legacy generators who are saying, hey, we just got jumped, or someone who's in a queue for a long time that has, an investment in place, and then a legacy generator jumps them?
So
like how we're going to handle that?
So can I address that? And Andy, correct me if I'm wrong. The generators that are sitting in our queue right now will not be affected by ERAS. Those queues, those generators are locked into that MTEP or that cycle of what improvements they have to be met. So generators that are sitting in the 2021 queue for MISO will only tied to MTEP 2021, not for what is added on later on. So we try to get away from the idea of queue jumping. These are projects at ERAS. We're trying to create a bridge so that we can get projects in to meet the state's needs for the large load growth that you're seeing, that we're seeing. So those projects behind will not be affected by ERAS. And that's an important fact that I think, Andy, if I misspoke, please correct me. But
maybe more generally, when people think they're getting jumped, that means that the project that goes through ERAS is getting access to transmission capacity that's going to be taken away from those projects in the queue, right? I got jumped, and so now I don't get the transmission capacity that ERAS projects got, which is incorrect. The way that MISO set this process up, they're in parallel. So those ERAS projects will not be taking away from transmission capacity that's available to those projects that are in the queue. So those projects are not going to be impacted from a transmission access perspective. Now, they may get their GIA faster, but the ERAS will not take away from the transmission capacity made available to those projects in the queue.
And I assume that the generators who are being expedited are being done so because they have the means or the capacity to, more quickly.
Yeah,
meet
absolutely.
that goal.
That COD requirement is much stricter on those projects that go through ERAS and those that go through the queue. So there's a much higher expectation and requirement for them to come online and meet those online dates.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Coltmeyer.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you, Judge. I'll be quick because I know we're short of time. I want to thank my fellow commissioners for their questions because it answered several for me. Kind of staying on that, will, no, let's scrap that one. Let me go back to the other one. Chair Hahn talked about the administration and FERC chair changing and everything else. And I asked this question last time you all were here about the Chevron decision. And I think everything that was too new and everything was on hold. Do you see that Chevron decision changing anything of generation and that kind of what's going on out there in the generation world?
I'm an engineer and not a lawyer, so so maybe I should, my recovering lawyer friend, maybe he can help me out here on that.
I'll be honest with you, Commissioner, I have not heard from our legal team how it would affect that, so I can't answer the question,
Okay,
but I will get our legal team to answer it.
okay,
I am a recovering lawyer
Okay,
and just,
sorry.
I'm totally, yeah, me too. Recovering lawyer and politician, which is two really
Ooh.
bad situations to be
I'm
in,
only
right?
recovering from one of those.
Yeah, well, I know which one too, so we can share that grief together. But I will get our legal team to take a look at it. It has not come up in the discussion as we're working through the ARIS program.
Okay,
But I will get the answer to you and your staff.
thank you.
On top of that, I have not heard, since the Chevron decision was struck down, I have not heard anything how that could impact the queue. But that doesn't mean there's not some threat I'm unaware of.
Okay, thank you.
Any other commission questions? Commissioner Mitchell?
Yeah, just a quick one. So the ERIS program doesn't compete with projects that are already in the queue, but
From a transmission access perspective, correct.
and can projects that are in the queue jump out and into the ERIS?
Yes, the way that we're designing eras is that if there's a project within our current queue cycle, that would meet the criteria that's in eras, then they could drop out of the queue and go into eras. There's a couple caveats. We have 3 phases, phase 1, 2, 3. So if you're in phase 3, we wouldn't allow you to drop out of the queue and go into eras. You should stay within your current queue cycle and get your GIA that way. Big reason there is because you drop out in phase 3, you're causing another restudy. There's no official off ramp, so that is going to impact the queue. And second, if you are in the queue, and you drop out, you're subject to whatever penalties that you normally would have. We're not going to exempt you from the penalties that or the harm calculations that you're subject to already under the tariff if you drop out.
And the timeline to reach commercial operation, that from the time that you submit the application to the time the project goes into commercial operation. I suppose that means when an application goes in that land is secured, designs are complete, permitting is well underway, and maybe even, long lead time equipment is already on order. So in your experience, is the 3-year time frame, how realistic is that?
We believe it is realistic. Let's do just a quick example. Let's say a project is submitted to MISO on June 1st of 2025. We'd process that and be able to get them a GI hopefully by third quarter, fourth quarter. So say September, October timeframe. That GIA would have to have a COD 3 years out. So 28, so 25, 28. Once they have that pro forma GIA, there's actually a grace period within that. The grace period was built into the pro forma GIA that FERC approved because existential threats happen, right? Supply chain disruptions or other construction delays, weather delays, whatever that might be. That 3-year grace period built into the GIA is supposed to cover those concerns, right? And so that generator that had a commercial operation date of 2028 on its GIA would technically have until 2031 to come online before we terminate those interconnection rights, and they can no longer come online. So they do have that leeway in the GIA. But even to meet those requirements, they have to have their engineering. They're going to have a pretty solid engineering plan already in place. Their procurement schedules on already determined. Working with their on the necessary permitting and things like that. So one of the things that we will be validating is the site control to make sure that that's a big reason we've seen a lot of dropouts too, is that they haven't done the proper landing control. So we will be checking that.
So I also imagine in that another benefit is that it really forecloses projects that are more speculative than anything else from entering the ERA's queue,
Right.
which fair to say that that's what's kind of clogging up the regular queue.
Part of it, yes. Yeah.
Thanks, that helped
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
Any other commissioner questions? Very quickly, are there any staff questions at this time before we move on to? I think we'll save other questions and move on to SPP so we can make sure we get everything
Thank you,
in.
Commissioners.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Ben Bright with SPP. I work in the regulatory group at SPP. Joined today with Casey Cathy, our VP of Engineering. He's going to address your questions and topics that you provided before the meeting. Happy to be here.
That's not it. Let's see. Go. All right. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? I just click right and left. Okay. All right. Happy to be here. As Ben mentioned, I'm Casey Cathy, Vice President of Engineering at Southwest Power Pool. Apologies for having to be virtual last two times, so I'm happy to be here physically. So I've got a fairly detailed deck for you this morning to complement the Word document with some of the questions y'all had. In the interest of time, I might skip through some of that, but there's certainly a lot of good content in there so you could consume, and either yourselves or staff, commission staff could have follow-up questions we'll certainly address. So the topics at a high level, SPP, our version of ERAS, I'd like to say everything Andy said, just ditto, but we are a little bit different in our approach and really status of where we're at from a generation capacity perspective. So I'll go through some of our current design there. Generator interconnection queue status and reform. We obviously have a different footprint and a different status. So giving commission update there. Reliability metrics, some of what Zach reviewed. SPP is looking at additional reliability metrics as it relates to resource adequacy. And then a single slide on transmission planning. I was requested to spend a little bit of time on some of the workings that are at play in transmission planning space specific to Missouri. Okay. So yeah, a lot of great questions and feedback from Andy on GI. If you look at generation interconnection just as a whole, some people say it's broken. Some people say it's clogged. It kind of depends on your perspective. If you look at the last 10, 15 years, if let's say the city of Joplin or Liberty Utilities sees a load growth, some economic growth 15 years ago, they would put in the resource plan and they would build probably a peaker unit, probably another combustion turbine. At that time, our GIQ process worked. It was very sequential in nature. It worked for incremental gas. It worked for even wind. We're kind of known as the wind RTO. We have over 15,000 wind turbines in our footprint, 34 gigs of installed wind. So you kind of look at GI and you can say, okay, something's broken. But at the same time, the last 10 years, we've facilitated 2,800 megawatts of wind built in commercial every year for 10 straight years. So it has worked up to this point. The last 4 years, we've seen unprecedented growth in the GI space. I would say it's not necessarily broken, but it was never designed for a wholesale fuel mix change. So our queue process was never designed to just retire coal and replace it with wind and solar and batteries. And that was kind of what we started seeing over the last 4 or 5 years. In parallel, we've seen a lot of unprecedented winter events, extreme conditions. In 2023, we saw a heat dome in the summer, so we're seeing extreme conditions in the winter. The last 4 winter seasons, we've seen 3 extreme winter storms: Winter Storm Uri, Jerry, and Elliott. And then in 2023, we saw a heat dome, so we're seeing extreme conditions and that's not just large load growth. So when you sort of point it, there's a rush to retire coal or, retire fossil fuels. There's sort of a rush to increase or build out renewables as fast as possible. This was before AI-driven data centers was even a topic. And so we started seeing this happen over the last 4 or 5 years, where our GIQ is not designed for this type of activity. Throwing out some numbers, we peak at 57 gigawatts as a system in SPP. So we are less than half the size of MISO from an overall load perspective. We've seen queues upwards of 24 gigawatts. And so without running, this isn't an engineering exercise, but without running a power flow, if we're already saturated at the transmission level and we're peaking at 57 and you want to add 22, 23 gigs of generation on top of that, you don't have to run a power flow to know you're going to hit all sorts of constraints all over the place. And the question is, are these GI customers willing to pay the transmission necessary to actually facilitate reliable power for when they interconnect? And the answer is no. It's a least cost process. These individual solar farms or gas plants aren't equipped to build out the transmission system individually necessary to survive. So we have a number of activities in the works to build out the transmission system to better embrace what we know to be coming. And it's not just for large loads or spot loads, it's also load growth across the board for SPP, as well as facilitating renewable goals. So if you look at ARES at a glance, it's a lot of what Andy said. There are some specific differences. And so in the interest of time, I think I'm just going to focus on the specific differences. For SPP, we're treating it as a single study, and we are cluster based. So we're going to a cluster for a single study. Ours is also called Expedited Resource Adequacy Study. So it's specifically tied to resource adequacy needs. And we are trying to slot it in this Q4 of this year and finish to the Q1 of next year. Okay. Some of the feedback we've received through the stakeholder process thus far is you're only saving 6 months. That's not the beauty of ARES. ARES is not just about saving 6 months, because 6 months, we all know, can be ate away very quickly. You've mentioned supply chain or ordering turbines. It can be ate away. What the beauty is of ARES is it is a specific study to allow for resource adequacy needs and load responsible entities to meet those needs without the noise associated with 23, 40 gigs of additional generation we're trying to contemplate. You mentioned speculative. Not all of the generation in our queue is speculative, but there are speculative projects that are sort of clogging that queue. ARES is specifically not just to meet resource adequacy, but it's serious projects that load responsibilities need, resource adequacy needs, as well as incremental load growth that we're seeing in the future. Some of the drawbacks, there's no benefit from prior queued upgrades. This will cost. It's going to, we're running an impact assessment. It's going to cost GI customers, SPP staff, and SPP as a whole. We are actively working on a number of fronts, and so we'll have to outsource a lot of the study data necessary to facilitate. And then the risks. There are a number of risks, and we've mentioned that already. Y'all had some questions around FERC and FERC's appetite. I would also echo Andy's response that this is not queue jumping. The way in which we're going about this is making it to where the existing GI in-flight queues are immune to the effects of ARES. And so the way that will occur on a high level is we'll facilitate the ARES study based on whatever has been through GIA process and all the existing ITP projects that were just approved in the 2024 ITP. And then we fold that in. And so all the existing transmission service, and then we run the study And whatever upgrades are necessary or incremental transmission capacity that those generators consume, we do not fold back into the in-flight queues. We pick it up on the next annual transmission planning cycle. So that's really important because that's one of the primary pushbacks on this study is whether or not this is actually affecting existing GI customers. So from a key points perspective, we are tying this to load responsible entities' needs. As you all know, our planning reserve margins are going up. In the 26 through 29 timeframe, that's a 36% winter and a 16% summer. We are also bringing to the Regional State Committee in 2 weeks' time a long-term planning reserve margin signal of 38-17. So 38% winter and 17% summer starting in the 2029 timeframe. And so we have all the data from a load responsible entities perspective on how much resources they have, what's accredited, what load they're projecting for the 29 and 2030 timeframe, and what planning reserve margin they also have to meet. And so what we're doing with ARIS is we're tying all that data together to prove the need at the individual LRE level and rolling it up to a regional level. And so that's sort of how we're calling it a ceiling. It's sort of a cap to the ARIS that this is specific to be able to meet those particular needs. So again, the request will be studied outside the DICES and updated with the latest ITP. I will say the last bullet, required upgrades will be directly assigned to the requested interconnection customer. We intend as SPP to bring this overall packet to the Regional State Committee in 2 weeks for vote as a policy. We are intending to walk through what we call a revision request. So all of the red lines necessary for the tariff, working through the stakeholder process in the next few months and bringing it and filing it to FERC in May. To this last point, we've received some feedback from some of our LREs that they would like a little bit different funding mechanism through what's called the Network Resource Interconnection Service Plus, so mouthful, and how we would actually allocate some of those costs, not just to directly assign, but maybe baseline fund some of those upgrades associated with ARIS. So I just wanted to mention that's part of the packet to the Missouri Commission, but that might be changed depending on where the stakeholders go. And so I think the thought process is that this is a regional need and we need kind of regional solutions associated with that. And if there's upgrades out of this ARIS single shot study, maybe that needs to also be funded regionally as well. Okay, so I might need to speed up a little bit. I think Andy covered majority of those, but I wanted to go to now this is probably problematic doing math in front of everybody. And so I'm not going to go through a whole formula and all this with you all, but just on a very high level, this gives an update on what we're thinking to best comply and limit. So here's the concern. You don't want to open up an ARIS study and then everybody sort of abuse the study in terms of they can manipulate it can happen. They can manipulate their data such that they encourage additional generation that may not be necessary for the single purpose of resource adequacy and meeting reliability needs. And so what we're doing here is we're sending the signal, we're educating, we've got 64 LREs, and we're saying, we're going to use this load forecast for 2030, what you submitted to us. And given the PRM that the Regional State Committee is setting for 2029, moving into 2030, we're going to do all the math and give some sort of a buffer. We call it a ceiling multiplier. But effectively, if you need 40 megawatts as an LRE and you're going to build a 100 megawatt plant, we're not going to dismiss that. So there's a little bit of overage just because of physical nature of machines that you can get. But effectively, that's how we're going to calculate it. And that sort of limits the study. So the fear is if we don't have this, we might have our same problem that we have in the queue, and we have an ARIS study outside of the queue, and you end up with 30, 40 gigs that you can't process. And so we want to make sure that it's very targeted and limited in nature from a magnitude perspective. Okay. So This last slide on the policy and estimations, we're calculating what we need as a region based on the calculations I just went through. It wasn't ready for prime time today. Otherwise, I would have presented it. We are trying to target the RSC in a couple of weeks, but you'll get the data as soon as we can get it. But the elevator speech is we have 100 gigawatts approximately in our queue. Okay, most of that is wind, solar, and batteries. Got maybe 6-7 gigs of gas. So most of it is renewables. Only about 40% of that historically goes commercial. So just, again, I'm doing math in front of you, but 100 to 40 gigs. So out of the 100, 40 gigs might go commercial. Out of that, roughly 25% is accredited. And that's simply because, solar is probably the easiest thing. I mean, it doesn't work at night. Wind's not that great in the summer, but averaging ballpark figure, it's about 25%. So 100 gigs down to 40 gigs, that's commercial. And this is our existing queue in flight. 25% of that is what? 10 gigs. So you go from 100 to 40 to 10. So we're at 10 gigs. And this is assuming everything that we know of in the queue is commercially viable at the 40% level. We get 10 more gigs as a region. We need 10 to 20. That's the elevator speech. So that's why we need ERAs, is we need anywhere from 10 to 20. And the reason why there's a range is because of load forecast errors, or the fact that there's uncertainty in load forecasts in the next 5-6 years. But if someone asks, why do you need ERAs? We need as much as we can. And this is also to Andy's point. We don't see ERAs as a supplanting the existing DICES queue. We need those projects that are commercially viable to still move forward. And then we also need ERAs. Okay, so this is approximate timeline. The key points here is that we would file with FERC in May, and then we're targeting the study to slot in this Q4, and it would be about 6 months, and we would hit GIA status at the end of Q1. And this gives you an overview of just all of the various activities. We are specifically following our stakeholder process as fast as we can, which would mean the RSC will bring it to the Regional State Committee May 5th. So I'll pause there because it's switching topics. After this, I'll pause here for ERA's questions.
Tirhan, do you have questions?
Not necessarily any questions, but Casey, I appreciate this very much. I think I know I've shared with Bob, but for you as well, I know it will come before the RSC, and we've been telling a story here in Missouri about additional load, additional need, and I think I always get asked about the queue. What takes so long? And so I think this is the timing is particularly acute for us to help support something like this, along with what we're doing here on our policy side to try to think about these large spot loads differently than other things too. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Holzman.
I want to go back to something that you started with, and you said that your peak is 57 gigawatts, and I think of electricity like water, and when you think about what makes good water pressure, well, it's the size of the plumbing system, right? The pipes, how much water can it move? So, basically what you said there was your transmission capacity is going to essentially control how much more you're going to be able to go over that peak load. And I'm sitting here thinking, okay, so how does ERAS then interact with the LRTP and Tranche 2? Is there going to be some dynamic play between, I guess my first question is do you have enough piping right now to meet load growth without, having Tranche 2 or any of the rest of the transmission, come online? Where's that ratio between that growth and how big the pipes are right now? And then my second question is how is ERAS going to interplay with the LRTP and sort of because it doesn't do us any good to have more generation if we can't get it to where it needs to go. Mm-hmm. And so is there a dynamic play between those two queues?
The first answer is no. We don't have enough pipeline. So SPP for the 2024 ITP, and it was a great portfolio. Worst case, 8-to-1 benefit ratio. So very strong portfolio, 7.7 billion. It was needed. And this is totally, we still have to go through the whole process, but looking at the 25 ITP, so we're every October, November timeframe, we bring another annual portfolio to the board directors. Given the load growth that we're seeing, and I'll give you some statistics, our 10-year out winter from the $7.7 billion portfolio grew 12 1 year. So that means that what drove 7.7 billion is good. That's great. But we're seeing 12% more in just 1 year time growth in one.
I'm sure forecast is going to say that is going to continue to grow as well.
Yeah. So it just helps illustrate the point that we're probably going to see that we're not over yet. We're not done yet. We're probably going to see another multi-billion-dollar portfolio. And so to answer the ERAS question, it is sort of what Andy mentioned, that this is more limited in nature, specific to allow for LREs to comply with this 5-6 year sort of bridge to get over the hump to build enough capacity for what we need. But future DICES and where we're heading at SPP is a consolidated planning process to merge the GI and the transmission plans together. That will be the ultimate, and that's a 12-month process. So soup to nuts, 100%, no restudy. You will get a GIA in 12 months. That's going to be sort of the long-term path for SPP. And so ultimately, we're going to need more transmission, timely transmission in parallel to all this generation.
And I'm just wondering, for every GIA you issue, does that accelerate some sort of transmission installation?
It accelerate. It's tied. So it's either tied to the transmission that's being built specifically for the GI customer, but we also, in parallel for our annual transmission plan, we look at the GI A's that are through, and we look at the load growth, and that helps drive transmission as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there other commission questions? All right.
All right, we can go back to do a time check. So 11:30 is the hard stop. Okay, so the GI process status. So we're getting into a lot of the Missouri specific slides. As Andy mentioned, SPP put up 2 things over the last 2 years that's on the website. So certainly I encourage you to go there if you're interested in, and it's updated twice a week. So it's very dynamic. And you can look specifically, you can filter on Missouri. It's a commercial operations date forecaster. You can kind of see what fuel types are in Missouri, when is it planned on going commercial, where the location is. So it's a lot of great information. I have some static slides here, so they're fairly up to date, but again, the website is more up to date. So some quick hits. We are getting through what we call a backlog. So in 2017, 2018, 2019 timeframe, I suppose right before the pandemic, we started stacking up. We couldn't get through a process. So we started seeing this early on where the queue was starting to get delayed. And then per our tariff, we had to open up another queue. And so it started getting clogged, and we could not get through it. So in 2021, we got FERC approval for what we call the backlog clearing plan. And so it is working. We've gotten through over 100, or we have 100 gigs in the cumulative generation. We signed 108 GIAs last year. So it is getting through these backlogged queues. And I guess the takeaway is that we plan on clearing all of the backlog clusters, except for 2023 might slide into 26. But by September of this year, we'll get through DICES 22. So we'll have 5 more clusters through GIA process. So again, when I mentioned the 100 gigs and 40 gigs typically go commercial, we still need that amount of generate. We still need that to go through. Hopefully it does. And so we're working through that process. And as you can see, some of the numbers, the new GIAs, we don't have a lot of solar in SPP, but we've been kind of looking at that as maybe the next frontier to get more solar. It's certainly complementary to a lot of the wind that we actually have in SPP. So you're kind of seeing an uptick in the amount of solar. Visually, this shows you the GI queue requests and the fuel type. So there is some solar in Missouri, some wind generation. We are expecting some level of gas to be increased. One caveat is our 24 DICES has another month to close. And usually customers wait for the last 2 weeks or so before the window closes. So we expect more requests in that queue. Okay, I do want to spend a little bit of time on this. I know there's a lot of numbers here, but it is good data once you sort of understand what we're saying. A lot of times when we give a queue update, people inevitably ask, what is real? What's actually going to happen? What's going to happen? We partner with Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, and we did a deep dive on all the data over the last 5 years, and we came up with a threshold. Certainly there's externalities and other reasons why maybe a solar farm falls through and doesn't go forward, but specific from an SPP data perspective, if you look at the cost of upgrades, the magic number is $120 per megawatt. And so what that means is that 91% of our queue goes forward if it's less than that threshold. And so we sort of saw a knee of the curve that if it's more than that, sometimes it goes through, but for the most part, it's costed out. It's too expensive for the GI customer to pay to integrate into the transmission system. And so what this is showing specific to Missouri only is on the right side, the high percentage of projects and the high percentage active upgrades. That gives you a better sense of what's real in Missouri based on SPP's data and what we suspect the upgrades will cost for those projects. Meaning, 3,900 megawatts, 3,972 is more realistic to be online in Missouri versus the 9,000 that's in the active queue. So it is good data. You kind of have to dive into it a little bit to understand it, but I'm going to skip through a few of these just for time's sake, unless y'all have questions. This is a picture of the queue dashboard. Again, that's on the website, and it's active, so you can click, Missouri, or you can click any of the fuel types, and you can sort of deep dive. One other thing is sort of in the middle with the bars. You can see what's active and what DICES. And then this is a recent, Andy mentioned this is the commercial operations date. Now, this is specific to the customer's validity in their commercial operations date. So they'll update it, but if it's wrong, it's wrong, but we publish what they tell us. And so if they're telling us that a certain, in this case, let's say a solar farm in Missouri is going commercial in 2027, that's the data we have. And again, it's updated twice a week. And the overall numbers, this is for SPP, but it gives you a sense of, again, the same data, lots of numbers, but from a high percentage active upgrade perspective, we're looking at 55 gigs roughly, that is commercially viable based on the upgrade costs that we're seeing versus the 82 that we're processing actively. And so it gives you kind of a sense of what is real. Well, this helps give that deeper dive. Okay, there's been some questions around how long is it taken. I think Commissioner Hahn, Chair Hahn, you mentioned IRA. There's a lot of things at play. We kind of talked about stacking up the queue, and then as they've grown, Andy mentioned restudies. That's certainly been a problem for SPP as well. This is a pretty good graph to kind of help illustrate the time of a particular cluster, as well as the volume of each cluster. And we put some numbers together for what we expect for ERAS. So that's on there as well. But I think there's a good takeaway here and a good story that we're shrinking the time. It is working. It's taking a while, but we're at the finish line for backlog, and we're paving the way for the future. And we're doing it at the same time that we're actually seeing larger numbers. So I think the takeaway is it's shrinking the time, and we're getting there. Okay, so our plan for ERAS is 2 years commercial with a potential 3-year extension. And so back to the timeline for Q1 of next year would be the Sun GIA. For ERAS, you just do the math. I think that's 2031 would be the max And so we're very similar to MISO. We have a built-in extension. I mentioned that because this is our commercial operations visibility for our queue, but all of this, and you can kind of see it very small in asterisk, but it could all slide out 3 years. And so Commissioner Holzman, you mentioned transmission timing. And so that is a concern because we can study it all day long, but if this generation maybe accelerates, but the transmission delays, that's a problem. If the transmission accelerates, but the generation delays, that's a problem as well. So we need to keep all of that sort of in check over the next 5 to 10 years. Okay, this is, yeah.
Do you find it to be more challenging to complete transmission projects versus generation projects? And because, we've had a history of landowner rights and other, challenges with transmission that doesn't seem to always be present in the generation side. So I was just curious if you, see one as more expedient than the other.
Yeah, I would say it depends. It's highly dependent on the location, the owner, the need. We've seen generation accelerated, but we've also seen delays in generation as well. So much so that they've gotten so close and then the project's tanked. Transmission, we've seen all over the board. We've seen transmission that's gone according to plan. We've seen some transmission. In fact, we have one facility, not in this state, that's taken at least 6 more years than the intended build date. So which is kind of skewing our numbers, but it's hard to say. It's kind of all over the place.
All right, thank you.
Yep. I think I'll skip through the next few slides. Again, there's a number of things at play at SPP. We're working on a consolidated planning process to consolidate GI and our long-term transmission plans. We're also expanding to the west. And so as we expand to the west, we are introducing the ERAS concept to them as well. The western states, and they have resource adequacy needs. They have a very similar problem. They need more transmission. And so we're sort of lining all that out. So the main theme here is we're isolating and setting up a really good 3-year plan to make sure that all of those things are in lockstep. The thing on this, again, it's very busy, great data though. The thing to read on this backlog mitigation plan is on the left side. So you can kind of see per row is all of our existing and in-flight queues. But we also have the number of GI requests and the amount of megawatts in each queue. Again, the takeaway here is that we will get through another 5 clusters this year, which is very exciting. Okay, I'm going to move forward to resource adequacy, unless y'all have questions for specific to GI. I think it's been somewhat dynamic. So, okay, I included a couple of resource adequacy slides, but to Zach's presentation, I do have a couple of reliability metrics. This is Missouri generation and SPP based on size and fuel type. So that's the existing snapshot. And this is our load responsible entity and sort of the makeup of the fuel type percentage-wise specific to Missouri state lines and SPP's territory specifically. Okay, moving to resource adequacy. 2 years ago, we elevated resource adequacy as our top #1 corporate risk at SPP. It's alongside cybersecurity, but we sort of joke that cybersecurity is probably always going to be a corporate risk forever, as long as we're relying on ones and zeros. But hopefully in the next few years, we will have gotten our hand around resource adequacy and have moved the ball forward enough to where we can reduce this as a risk. But it's still a risk. We've worked with regional state committee and commissioners, board members, and SPP members themselves on a number of fronts for resource adequacy, at least 24 over the last 2 years. So a lot of different policy, and certainly we could answer any questions on those. But specific to the commission's questions on reliability metrics, we are contemplating a very similar as MISO. Currently we use, and it's in our tariff, 1 day in 10. We've actually tracked that down to back to the 1960s, but no one can really confirm. It's one of these, you don't know exactly where it came from, but I think it was an industry recognition that there's affordability and reliability balance, right? We could have 0.5 days in 10. So instead of 1 day in 10, let's cut the metric in half. But there's an exponential cost component to that where you're sort of gold plating the system. You're building more generation than maybe you need most of the time. And so that's that balance. And historically, it's worked. Zach mentioned that for MISO, it's worked for SPP. What we've seen in the last few years, not just the extreme conditions, but we've seen even in our shoulder months, so October months, May months, where it should be fairly decent business, where you're not having reliability issues, you're not at summer peak. We're seeing resource adequacy problems. We don't have enough bandwidth and overhead to allow for all the necessary generation maintenance. And so there's a number of problems and challenges we have in resource adequacy. And again, even if large spot loads and AI-driven data centers stop and they don't happen, SPP needs more generation and transmission anyway. So from a reliability metric perspective, where we're heading with some of the considerations is around what we're calling expected unserved energy. So think about it this way. We run in this loss of load expectation study. It's fancy, but what you're really doing is you're kind of looking at various load profiles and you're looking and you're running various scenarios on what would fail. Again, all machines have pros and cons. Gas has pros and cons. Wind has pros and cons. Sometimes the wind doesn't blow. We saw in Uri gas pipeline infrastructure and winterization issues on gas. And so just pick your fuel type. Hydro has some challenges as well. Nuclear has refueling issues. They don't like to move. I mean, you just pick a fuel type and there's going to be pluses and minuses. And so what we're seeing with expected unserved energy is as we continue to move towards more of an inverter-based, renewable heavy fleet, instead of a single machine, such as a coal plant tripping, we have to simulate a large profile of, let's say, wind drops over a series of time. So instead of losing, let's say, Wolf Creek, which is our single largest contingency, it's a very large nuclear facility in Kansas. Instead of just losing that on a single problem and it trips, we have to protect for that. Sure, loss of load expectation is a great simulation for those single events. When it comes to EUE, we have to protect from losing 13 gigs of wind over a 6-hour period of time. And that's what we see. And so this is why this metric is being considered in trying to determine, again, this affordability and reliability sort of tug of war. We want to make sure that if we're going to introduce this additional criteria, we're not too aggressive to where we ultimately cost ratepayers money more than what is necessary to maintain at least the reliability that we've enjoyed over the last couple of decades. And so that's what we're working on this year. And it's probably going to take the full year to make sure that we're all on the same page for SPP and SPP's LREs and the board and the RSC on what would be appropriate. I can say internationally, we work with EPRI and multiple countries are even looking at this criteria. And it's teeters around what's called 2 to 3 parts per million. Again, a quick math, it's a measurement of what percentage of load would you put at risk for all of annual energy. So quick math, SPP is roughly 300 terawatt hours last year. A little bit shy of that, but just make it round numbers. If you take 1 part per million, that's 300 megawatts out of 300 terawatt hours. 2 parts is double that, so 600 megawatt hours out of 300 terawatts. So what I'm illustrating is this is a way of not just having a frequency criteria of we're okay with 1 day loss of load every 10 years, but also when that happens, how deep of a cut are we willing to take? Are we willing to take 5% of our load? So the higher parts per million, the less reliable you are. So anyway, that's a key metric that we're working through. I think I'll pause there. I think that's we only have 1 slide on transmission planning, but I think that covers the resource adequacy slides I was intending on mentioning.
Any questions at this point, commissioners? Thank you.
Okay. One last slide, which, let's see, right here we go. Well, it looked bigger on my iPad. It's like I gotta squint for, I can see it here. Okay. So you're probably familiar with some of the transmission plans and approval process from the 2024 ITP, specifically around Elliott, Winter Storm Elliott, and protecting for similar type events, mostly in the southwest part of Missouri. But I was asked to talk about something else, which actually isn't even on the screen, but it's in draft form. We're meeting and working with Associated Electric, as well as Ameren and MISO, and Evergy. So Evergy is one of SPP's members. And they're contemplating a facility that would definitely help support reliability and economics in Missouri. And that would be a 345 kV line through the middle of Missouri. And it would start, I don't know if I have a laser pointer, but it would start, oh, that's weird. It doesn't work on the screen. There is a transmission substation at the middle part of Missouri on the west side. So you can see that dot where 4 345 kV facilities converge. So it would start there and go straight across the middle of Missouri. It is in its infant stages of draft, but I guess the takeaway or what I'd like to convey to the Missouri Commission is we are working together with Associated, Ameren, and MISO, and of course Evergy as our member to determine minimum what's the reliability implications to this particular facility if, let's say, Associated and Ameren would like to build it. Also, are there economic benefits such as maybe potential cost sharing and so forth? So more to come there, but that is a potential great facility and reliable facility for SPP and MISO and Associated Missouri ratepayers, basically. So I think that's all I had on that one. Any questions on that or anything else?
Any other questions from the commission? All right, did staff have any questions for SPP really quickly?
Hey, Casey, Rich Germinder with the commission. You mentioned your ARIS proposal. MISO is looking for an attestation from essentially the state commission or regulatory authority. What are you guys looking at in that vein? Are you looking at anything?
Yeah, we actually, I mean, you could hear, we borrow best practices from MISO back and forth. And I think originally we were thinking of the RERA, but we're structured a little differently with the regional state committee. We give the RSC more authority in SPP. And so our attestation will follow the RSC, and we don't plan on going at the individual L. Or it's somewhat better for us in that way because from an efficiency perspective, as long as the RSC signs off that it's appropriate to meet resource adequacy needs, and that's all we need from our tariff obligations. Yep.
Any other staff questions?
Hi, Casey, Walt
Hey,
Cecil. You've talked about ARIS, and I have warm fuzzies for that. I like the idea conceptually. But when you start working on it and it becomes a reality, are you going to have the resources to do ARIS and the DISIS at the same time? And I'm going to throw that at Andy. Will do the DPP and do ARIS as well? Or
Yeah,
how's that going to work?
the short answer, and I'll let Andy answer for MISO, but the short answer is no. We will be contracting out the study itself, but our primary intent is to not move or disrupt existing commitments. That includes existing in-flight DISIS queues, DISIS 24 in particular, as well as our consolidated planning process, because strategically that is extremely important for SPP as a region. So yes, we don't have the staff to support ARIS. We will be contracting out a majority of the study.
And I'm going to say the same thing as Casey, but I'm going to start with a yes instead of a no. Yeah, we anticipate the increased workload. And so what do we need to do for staffing and consulting levels to be able to meet that expected demand?
Okay. I'd like to follow up with this one. Supposing that the ARIS actually does what it wants, it clears the backlog. How are you going to manage the system so that you don't end up in this place again in a few years?
CPP is our answer. So consolidated planning process, and it's on the timelines. There's a lot of detail there. Probably didn't have time for it, but it is in the deck. And we anticipate our first CPP soup to nuts middle of 2028. And then after that, it'll be a 12-month, you show up and you pay the entry fee and you get a GIA in 12 months. There's no restudy. There's, more financial obligation on the front end to be real. But there's no DICES 3-phase study. There's no, speculative projects are out the window because you have to be serious to show up or otherwise you're paying. And so that's our long-term goal. And so hopefully we wouldn't need another ARIS because we'd have that 12-month cycle.
Throw that at Andy now.
We're not doing a CVP. We need to have separate processes, but as I explained for my testimony, the work we're doing now to get the queue down to 1 year. So by that same 2028 timeframe, we'll continue to have a 1-year MTEP process and a parallel 1-year DVP process. And so that will allow us to move forward with all those projects.
And if I may add on to that, Walt, real quick, and it's our intention, and I'm sure it's SPP's intention to keep everybody updated as we proceed, not only with ARIS, but so we keep commission and commission staff involved in how we're proceeding to get to that 1-year timeframe. I think it's important that we keep everybody informed on that, either through IPWG or through the PAC. We'll keep that those reports flowing.
Chair Hahn, you had additional.
Yeah, Casey, on your last slide, this 345 kV line, I'm just still trying to process that. I think this is fairly monumental of the groups working together. Do you have any analysis of this line on cost and benefits? No. Okay.
No. Yeah, go ahead.
The answer is no. But I think what you just mentioned is the key, that all of us are in a room working to try to solve a problem that this commission has asked for us to do. And that's sort of where the stage we are looking at right now. Very early development, but I can speak, Aubrey and he talked yesterday about stuff. So there's a great communication going on between SPP and MISO as we continue to develop better relationships and moving this line forward.
Just want to say thank you. It's not lost on me probably how much work has already gone into this. So just appreciate everyone going in that direction.
Yep.
Were there additional questions, Mr. Cecil?
I had one, and it's for Andy. You were talking about your DPP being automated in the future. It's my understanding that the biggest contributor to the backlog really is the amount of time that the different participants in the cluster have to make a decision whether they're going to continue forward or not. And how do you automate around that?
We actually addressed that in 2023 and into early 2024. We called it the cure period harmonization. That was a concern that we had, is that there were multiple different cure periods that a developer could utilize to extend their decision on whether or not they're going to stay or drop out. And so we did do that and got that approved by FERC, and that shortened that time frame. So the overall reason for the queue delays is each year it's something different. When I first took this job in 2020, it was all about the lack of transmission service and that people were just dropping out of the queue because there wasn't transmission. Well, MISO did tranche 1 in 2022, and just last year we did tranche 2.1. So we're fixing that. Then there were concerns about effect system studies slowing each other down. SPP and MISO addressed that through JTIQ. We did Q priority, got that approved in 2022. We're doing that with PJM right now. Now what we're seeing is these restudies that are happening that are causing these later studies to continue to move. MISO is addressing that with our automatic withdrawal penalty. So every time the cure period harmonization you just asked about, there's always a little something that's slowing the process down, and we're just trying to block and tackle each of those and address them as we identify them.
And are there other stakeholders? Oh, Adam?
Sorry, just one, not quick one. Adam McKinney with the commission. I had a discussion with one of my colleagues watching online, and it led to the question of how do we make sure we don't sell the same capacity twice? Once in the ARIS study and then once in the GIQ study.
Yeah, so for SPP, we are trying to make it a simple answer. We're basically not including the effects of ARIS transmission capacity usage in the in-flight DICES, but we true it up in the subsequent ITP. And so that's the way in which we effectively are, I guess we're killing two birds there. We're addressing the higher queued concern that queue jumping is occurring and affecting in-flight customers. So that it removes that argument because it won't impact their impacts or flows in in-flight DICES. And then two is it trues up that notion of overselling or double dipping on the transmission capacity because we ultimately build regionally out of the subsequent ITP. And that's on top of the identified upgrades out of the ARIS study itself.
And-
Ditto.
And one last call for any other questions? We appreciate both MISO and SPP joining us today and appreciate your continued participation in these updates. And I believe with that, unless the commission has anything further, we can be adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Glenn, you know your record.